Lecture number 8. We can't talk about colonial society without talking about the families that the colonists created. Human societies, wherever they go, are fundamentally organized by the family group, and the way they define those families differ over time. The size of them, the legality of their relationships, who's in, who's out, all of those things change over time. But however the family group is defined becomes the foundation of the society that they create. So in this lecture, we're going to talk about the families that colonists brought to America and the families that they created when they were in America, and specifically how those family relationships developed over the course of the 18th century. To understand colonial families, one of the first things you have to understand is how sparsely populated the colonies were by the white inhabitants. The commonest experience was what I've shown here as rural isolation. People might have a village that they could get to, but for the most part, they lived away from any other families. They didn't live in cities for the most part. They didn't have shopping markets that they could get to easily. So they were highly reliant on their family, on one another, for being able to provide all of the goods that they needed. And we call this a subsistence economy, or in some instances, a local market economy. What a subsistence economy means is that they are growing all of the things that they need for themselves. They're not only growing their food, which some of us might even do today, grow a few tomatoes here and there. They're producing the fabrics that they need to clothe themselves, so they are growing flax for linen, they are raising sheep for wool. They are raising their own meat, and then the hides of those cattle and those sheep become shoes, become other articles of clothing. They are building their own homes, they are building their own fences. Everything that their family needs, they are producing for themselves. The few things that they cannot produce for themselves, they're reliant on a local market to get. And that might mean, I have a cow, but I don't know how to make shoes. I'm going to trade my cow hide to someone else who's going to make shoes with them and trade them back to me. It's very neighborly and kind of goes in a circle around the neighborhood instead of trading outside the community. It was only a very few products like lead for bullets, glass for windows, paper for newspapers and letter writing. Those kinds of products. Tea was another important one that the colonists could not produce for themselves. They could not get from their local market, and those things they were reliant on Britain to send to them. And so imagine that you live out in nowhere, New York, and you somehow have to get yourself to Albany, get yourself to New York City in order to buy some windows that you can put in the log cabin that you built by hand. It was a very unusual experience for people to go to a market like that. Mostly they were reliant on themselves out in the countryside, just themselves and their families. Their families were created around what we can call a European marriage tradition. That meant that the husband and wife were at the center of the family. This is not true for all human cultures. If you look at even a lot of Native American families, the most important person in the household was the mother. The family was organized around the mother, and her brothers were more important to her children than their actual biological fathers. So that's just one example of how a family can differ from what we might be used to in our European marriage tradition. So they expected a husband and wife to be at the center of the family. Husbands and wives came together out of economic need, not because they loved one another. We don't begin to see romantic or what's called companionate marriage until the very end of the 18th century and into the 1800s that people begin to marry for love instead of marrying for economic purpose. The subsistence economy that they lived in required people to get married. We'll talk a little bit more about the division of labor in just a second, but there was so much work to be done to try to help a family survive that you really couldn't live by yourself. If you lived alone, almost by definition, you were poor because you couldn't provide everything that you needed for a family by yourself. A European family is patriarchal. That means that the adult man is at the head of the household and has control over everybody else in the household. Usually that adult man is the husband of the household. Sometimes in some parts of the colonies, it would be the father of the husband. In the Southern tradition in particular, the oldest man in the household was the person who was in charge, even if he was not married because he was an elderly widow. If he was the oldest man in the household, he got to be in charge. This is, of course, a patriarchy. The idea of a patriarchy is one solitary old man being in charge, and everybody else, the women and the children, the servants, being subordinate to that man. He gets to call the shots. In some parts of America, most especially in New England, but you also saw it in other parts of the American colonies, to get married and be in a family was a religious obligation. There's a famous injunction in the Old Testament where God tells Adam and Eve to go forth and multiply, or maybe it was Noah after the flood. God told some people, go forth and multiply. And the Puritans in New England in particular took this very seriously. They were not just having children, which was wonderful. They were having Christians. They were having little godly people that were going to grow up to be more godly people. And so they saw their responsibility being to further Christianity and their Christian beliefs throughout the world. And they did that by marrying and by having children.